The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada on Reality Radio 101. Get ready to talk, email, or post a message to us. We are looking forward to speaking with you and responding to your questions. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you again today. This is Dr. Anna Baranowski, the Bear Psychology Radio Show, bearing witness to evolving mind, mood, health, and conversations about trauma, recovery, relationships, work, and life adventures. So I'm really looking forward to our show today. And I want to just reinforce this idea that the most profound changes occur when a person truly feels heard and understood. And I like to think of it as deeply bearing witness to life evolving. We can feel incredibly stuck when we live with our fears, stressors, and troubles alone. But when we share and we dialogue and we feel supported and understood, it provides a powerful foundation for us to move forward in understanding and care. And I like to think of this as part of all of our evolution. So today we're really fortunate because we have Dr. Hannah Scott, who is an expert in victimology, but actually she is an expert in bullying. Now, her work comes from a victimology background, but she's really been able to take what she's learned from intimate partner violence and kind of pour that into her understanding of what happens to people when they're bullied at the workplace. And in my clinic, I just always have somebody during the week who's been exposed to something that has been deeply disturbing and really evocative of this kind of bullying, harassment issue. And I've seen a lot of people just struggle so profoundly with the impact of being bullied at the workforce. So Dr. Hannah Scott is a professor, and she's with the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, which is where she's doing her unique bullying project. And we'll get a chance to ask Dr. Scott about what she's learning. I also want you to think, if you're listening to us today, if you've been bullied at your workplace, recognize that you're not alone. It's very, very common. And I hear every day from people from all walks of life who've struggled with being bullied at the workplace. And that, this whole thing about workplace bullying, it really is a violent act. It's an aggressive act, and it makes sense if you're encountering bullying that it will have an impact on you. And it's not simply just about, being tougher or looking the other way or any of those things. It is really, really potentially devastating. So thank you very much, Dr. Scott, for joining us, and I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about your work.
Thank you very much, and I'm really happy to be here, and I'm excited to talk about this study.
Fantastic. I'm really interested in what I'm seeing here. Like I have posted this to our social media. We do that very frequently, but I just went online and I can see that there's been 4,732 views of your we posted your wheel of power and control, and people are really, really interested in this topic of being bullied at work. So maybe you can tell me a little bit about how you came to want to study bullying in the workforce.
Well, it actually came about by accident. It's sort of a set of stars aligned for me. One thing that happened was I was actually teaching something called the power control wheel for intimate partner violence. That's something that many criminology students know, many people who study domestic violence are aware of. It is a tool that's been used since the 80s to help identify techniques that the bully is using, or the abuser, in this case the intimate partner abuser, is using towards a victim. So initially the tool, there was a wheel, it had 8 spokes with violence and sexual aggression on the outside. And the basic premise of this wheel was to say that abusers abuse because they wish to exert power and control. And the story behind it is quite beautiful. I can give it a short synopsis. The researchers, Pence and Paymar, when they were developing this wheel, when they were talking to victims of intimate partner violence, they said that the victims stated that although there was physical and sexual violence in their relationships in many cases, they could tolerate that. It was the day-to-day abuse that was happening, the name-calling, the intimidation, the moments of silence, the using children against them, and so on. And so they collected all of these responses about this day-to-day activity of abuse and created the power control wheel. What I did, we were looking at workplace violence as one of the segments in my course, and I started to see the connections between this intimate partner violence wheel, or the power control wheel, and some of the same exact behaviors that we were seeing in the workplace. So I adapted the wheel, and I started to do some research to see whether or not I was right in some of those assumptions. Were people describing some of the same behaviors that they would see in intimate partner violence in these semi-intimate partner relationships at work, where people spend incredible amounts of time, have friendships and so on, and collegial relationships. And sure enough, we were seeing some of the same things. So I launched a study this summer after I published that model to see if to really tap into whether or not what I was reading in the literature and what I was thinking about these ideas was actually would resonate with people who had been victims of bullying. So I launched a pilot study. I expected maybe 100 to 200 responses. It was online. We didn't have a large budget for promotion. The university was a very willing partner in helping promote it, as was our local paper. But within the month that it was launched, it received almost 2,500 responses.
Mm-hmm.
This survey
was something about how hungry people are for an outlet to speak about this issue, and how alone people must feel if they're responding to something like this. Just such a big need. So congratulations on finding your way to speak to an issue that's so crucial.
Thank you. And the other one thing about this study that I noticed is people were answering it on Friday nights and Saturday mornings, and it's a long survey. And when we look at the number of people who actually completed this, it could be a long survey. If you were really talking about your experience, 1,185 people completed the survey with full responses. It was unbelievable. So there's definitely a need out there. People are not alone. Preliminary results looking at this wheel and whether or not it's resonating with people, because the survey was structured around how the wheel works. I got informal responses, people contacting me saying, I'm so glad you're doing this research. I didn't know anybody really understood what I was going through. It just touches a soft spot in my heart. It tells me that we're on the right track here.
Mm-hmm. It's nice when you figure out a way to make a difference and to do something that's so meaningful, which clearly this is. I mean, this was I had a radio show a couple of months ago, and I talked about bullying at the workplace, and it was something that people responded to very powerfully during the show as well. That it just strikes a chord. It's this unspoken topic. Like, it's just not getting the airtime. I have a question about something that came to mind as you were describing what was happening in the intimate partner research. Do you believe that it's the same people who have these tendencies of bullying at home or violence at home that are then going into the workplace and behaving in these really harsh and violent ways in the workplace.
There's no real evidence to support that. There's no study that's actually tracked a bully from an intimate partner situation into a workplace situation. And this is largely because the kinds of ways that we can do criminological research. If you are an abuser in your home, you're not really willing to admit it, and then you're not really willing to be studied for it. So we talk to victims about their bullying experience, and victims in intimate partner violence are often not the people who they work with. And so it's a very difficult subject to try to tap into. However, some of these stories that I'm reading now as I start to analyze more of the qualitative research here, suggest that in some cases they said, well, the bully was a very nice person outside of work, but inside work they were horrible. In some cases, people said that they maybe they were bullied at home, but they certainly were bullying at work. But there's really nothing to support that at this time.
Mm-hmm. And it just seems it's very covert as well. Like, it seems to me that sometimes a person at work can be bullied, and it's hard to really put your finger on it and say exactly, yes, I was actually bullied at work. It could take months and months and even years before it becomes really apparent that this is truly bullying and that the victim sees it as this.
One of the reasons why I created the wheel, one of the many reasons I'm starting to realize that a lot of things have aligned here, but is to make the distinction, and I don't think a lot of people have done this. In fact, I think I'm the only one who started to make the difference, the idea that there is both overt and covert abusive forms. So in the workplace environment, the covert forms, the things that other people witness, for example, things that and behaviors that other people would definitely understand as bullying, or would be easily interpreted as bullying if the story was to be told. Those kinds of things are less common, just like we saw in the intimate partner violence. The things that other people see and could see clearly as abuse are not there as often. What we are seeing, just like in the intimate partner violence cases, is it's a day-to-day, subtle, covert type of response. Overt is the thing that we see out in the open, and covert is the thing we see in quiet and in subtle ways. Mm-hmm. Excuse my terminology there.
Yeah, that's okay. I got it. Yeah, I'm sure everybody is catching it.
Yeah, so the covert things that people are responding to are things like stares across a room, right? Because we now know in intimate partner violence that abusers could control a target by staring at them across the room or mentioning a word that only really the target and the offender know. And we see the same sort of things in situations in bullying where, for example, a bully may use a word that really is only understood between the target and the bully, be referring to an earlier conversation that might have been had. But nobody else in the room really understands that. Or they're denied promotion or denied training or they're denied opportunities. They're not told about events or social events or meetings. They're given excessive work schedules with unreasonable timelines. They're micromanaged. And individually, these are all tools that employers can use, and individuals can happen, and some of these things can happen inadvertently. But taken together, and this is what the intimate partner violence wheel did for victims of domestic violence, and what I think this wheel will do for individuals, is we'll be able to take it all together, and we'll see that there's a long history of negative and adverse behaviors that can result in things like disability claims and so on.
Yeah, everything you're saying just resonates so powerfully, and it really aligns perfectly with much of what I've heard from many people. I want to read something to you that came in from Janice Wirehan, who is actually a social worker, and she runs the Burnout Queen. And she's been working in her field for like over 20 years and has had a great career and done well. And she's given us permission to read this, but I want to run it by you because I think it may fit well in everything you know. She says, my first experience with workplace bullying began when I was employed by a large health organization. This is 20 years into her career, so this makes it really interesting, because here's somebody who's had, lots of success and has thrived and has never had a problem with employers or coworkers. So she says, there were a handful of long-term employees who were the main bullies. When a few brave employees would bring this to the manager's attention, they were told to toughen up. In the 2 years I was employed at this location, the bullying continued. The management did not address the situation, and numerous employees resigned and moved to different positions. Eventually, I decided this would be my only option as well. So this is something that I think happens quite a bit, that organizations end up losing really terrific employees because they've got a toxic work environment. So she goes on to say, I transferred to another site location in the organization with the thought that I would put it all behind me and make a fresh start. Within the first 2 weeks that I was employed in this new position, I received an unexpected telephone call from my union rep stating that the manager had a concern about my social work practice and a meeting would be held to discuss this in more detail. Now, that's so interesting, because I always find that it always seems to start with a meeting that leads to the end for the individual who's being bullied. Going on, the writer says, the meeting included the manager, human resources, the union rep, and myself. The following concerns were brought forth. 1, apparently on one occasion I came to work with a small amount of dog hair on my pants. 2, I'm not laughing at the writer. It just seems so horrifying that this is the complaint. 2, on another occasion, someone apparently observed I had spilled a small amount of food on my blouse. This is quite possible since I often worked at my computer over the lunch hour. Lastly, there was concern that I was being too nice to the patients I served. These patients were both inpatient and outpatient, many of them terminally ill. I pride myself for having a good sense of humor and trying to make a dying patient laugh. I mean, you can kind of feel the compassion of the writer, just that, her willingness to kind of make life a little easier for those she was working with. She goes on to say, I recall on one occasion during the Christmas season, I asked a terminally ill patient if he was on Santa's naughty or nice list, and it brought me such pleasure to see him laugh and joke with me. I was always friendly with the patients and would ask them about their pets or updates on sports if that was their interest. Like, she's really kind of trying to understand things from the individual's perspective. So she goes on to say, the bullying by my manager was the birth of, I guess the work she's doing now. And although I love the patients that I worked with, she ends up saying the only way she could really get through it was to leave the organization. And I think that is often what ends up happening. So I want to just thank Janice Werahan. She's started the Burnout Queen, for sending that in, because I think it lays out a lot of the issues that seem to happen when we hear about bullying in the workplace. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think 2 things are happening there. One, there was a real solution on the part of the individual who just wrote this letter to try to fix the situation themselves. They identified a problem. They were there for 2 years. They ended up trying to move themselves out, if I heard that correctly, into another location. One of the things that some of the people in my study has mentioned, they're so smart, the people who did this study. Some of them identified what they called, and there's 3 or 4 people that identified something called a bullying legacy issue. So, and they properly identify it. The idea that, so for example, when someone takes proactive control, tries to solve the situation, tries to move elsewhere in the organization, and many times this is really successful, but in some cases, the bullying behavior can follow the person, either because that person continues to exert influence in that organization, or in some cases where they've actually terminated the bully. The bully's been there for a long period of time, and so what they've done is actually all of the opportunities for retraining and training enhancement and so on and mentorship have happened by the bully to people below them. So the people who now are prepared and trained and have that experience were actually mentored by the bully, and thus may not change the behavior towards the target if the target remains. So it's kind of interesting to watch how this is all playing out. She finally decides that she has to leave the organization. And we do find a lot of people who actually find that solution as well. It's something that the individual has to carry with them. They're not supported as where they go through this. They have to go through financial insecurity. Leaving a job, especially if you've been doing it for a long period of time, can be extremely stress-producing. And in some cases, people are leaving because they have been abused for so long with other mental health issues and physical health issues that are related to stress and strain.
Yeah, Janice goes on to say that she says, at first I did not realize I was beginning to burn out. But you know what, when I think about burnout, I don't necessarily arrive at it when somebody tells me they were bullied at the workforce. I look at that as exposure to extreme stress and align it more closely with trauma because of, my trauma background, really helps me to kind of conceptualize the symptoms that I'm seeing with somebody who has been bullied, and the similarities are also very, very, very clear to me. So Janice goes on to say, initially she thought she was just stressed, depressed, and tiring more easily because she was, getting older, and in hindsight recognizes that she was physically and emotionally exhausted, beginning to develop a negative attitude towards coworkers and the job, and began doubting skills and feeling incompetent. And this, her description here, it seems to me that was really arising because of the bullying. And again, my kind of thoughts about trauma and PTSD, post-traumatic stress. What are your thoughts about that?
I think there's a lot to be said for the idea. There's a sort of everyday distinction about being burnt out, but many of burnout symptoms do take some of the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress disorder, where somebody literally now has a diagnosis and must take stress leave or disability. Certainly some of the cases that we see and the symptoms that people are recounting who are currently going through bullying situations do sound like post-traumatic stress disorder. At the very least, they're having intense anxiety going into work. They are. There's a beautiful statement here that from one of the people that I read, and if I could try to, let me read it to you, and because I can't use it, I'd like to use their words instead of mine.
Oh, I'd love to hear it. Thank you so much.
Okay, so this person had a former boss who was vice president of operations, was very narcissistic, and would be extremely passive-aggressive. He would ignore me but not include me in areas in which, as a manager, I should have been included in. I take all credit for my achievements. Otherwise, it made it very extremely difficult for me to achieve my goals. This lasted for over 10 years. I found my productivity waned and my actual health deteriorated. My passion, my role declined. I found myself losing sleep, commuting to work only to turn around and take a sick day just so I didn't have to go into work that day. I would keep information, or he would keep information from me on projects such as annual budgeting, so he could see the effort I put in only to pick it apart. It was like he would do everything to watch me move a mountain, and then I'd finish moving the mountain, and he would say, that was the wrong mountain to move.
Wow.
And so that encapsulates burnout. Yes, clearly this person is tired, exhausted, but they're also recording things like sleep disorder, intense anxiety going to work, lack of motivation could be interpreted as depression. All of those things play a role in post-traumatic stress disorder and exposure to long-term trauma by an abuser.
Yeah. And all this belittling behavior and how it undermines a person's sense of themselves, their competence, especially if they've really always been a good hard worker and felt, a lot of confidence as a result of doing well at work. To have that taken away can be very demoralizing. I want to read this email that came through from Frank, and he says, hello, doctors. That's to both of us, Hannah, and very interesting topic. How do we access the study of Dr. Scott? So can you speak to that?
Oh, that's easy enough to do. You can go to the UOIT website. I'm just pulling it up right here, and search for workplace bullying, or it's at socialsciences.uoit.ca/workplace bullying, all one word. And the idea here, there's a number of things that are on there. The study itself, because it's been written up in a journal, I'm not allowed at liberty to give unless for educational purposes. It's written in the Journal of Health and Safety. And if you have a library account or were at a university and have an alumni account, you should be able to have access to the library to be able to get the study. Academic journals, being what they are, copyright is protected on certain things, and we sign that over when we publish our stuff in peer-reviewed journals.
Of course, yeah. So again, I'm just going to repeat that Dr. Hannah Scott works with the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, and that, you know, particularly I think people are very interested in your power and control wheel, and I believe that is actually right on the website. It can be seen right on the website. That's one that I find really interesting. We posted a link to your website on our LinkedIn account, and that's available as well for those who are interested. So please do, search that out, because it's quite informative.
The copy of the workplace bully wheel, though, is there. We have it in a PDF so that you can take it and use it. If you're being bullied at work, and it, like many targets have reported, they can't necessarily understand what their bullying is doing. They just know that when they go into work, they know they're being bullied every day. Trying to explain it to others when they don't necessarily feel like they're being understood. It's words, it's use of intimidation, it's standing too close, it's micromanaging. The wheel will actually help you to identify some of those tasks. One of the hopes that I have for this wheel for people, as I did spend time as a grievance officer and president of my union at UOIT, was we saw a lot of grievances where there was, people were trying to explain, and they felt that they were bullied, and when we were trying to help them, we had trouble understanding what their experience was. And so as I started to build this wheel, people who I've shown it to, both in my own environment and every other environment where there's bullying, which is every environment, they've looked at it, people who have been targets of bullying and have self-admitted that they've been targeted of bullying. They look at the wheel and they say, yeah, my boss did this, my boss did this. Oh, but wait a second, my boss did this too, and they did this too. I didn't know that was part of bullying. And we hope that will be able to help them make complaints about the bullying behavior by showing a constant and consistent exposure to negative behavior by a bully.
Oh, that is absolutely perfect. So I'm going to just go through this really quickly so listeners know what you've got here, and maybe we could talk about some of these things. You can clarify how they actually are used specifically. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about the wheel in a minute. Before I do that, we've got another email from Fred, who is saying, what is Dr. Scott's contact information? Thank you. And P.S., does Dr. Scott have a book out? And I think that, Hannah, I think this is a call for you to write this book.
Well, that's what we're trying to do right now. I'm in the process of analyzing. We've done the quantitative data. Now I'm trying to find a publisher, because we have to do those kinds of things. It's still a book that needs a home. But I don't anticipate that would be too much of a problem. My university's been very supportive in giving me 6 months off to actually write this book or a series of articles. We're not sure what it's going to look like, but we are keeping people updated on the website as to where to find this, because people are asking for this. And again, it's the first time I've done research, and as an academic, somebody actually saying we need to see this. Mm-hmm. A lot of times researchers feel like they're writing and nobody hears what they have to say.
Yeah. You're in a vacuum. It's like, what? I didn't know you did anything. Exactly. So these are the items that I think are so profound on this power and control wheel. Using coercion and threat, using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, minimizing, denying, and
blaming the victim.
And blaming. Right, yeah. Using coworkers, using employer privilege, using economic abuse, and I'm going to start with this again, using coercion and threat. So can you tell me on this wheel what it is that people need to kind of focus on? Like, what do you think are the greatest risks and why?
Okay, so there's sort of three ways that this wheel sort of speaks to people. The first is that in the center of this wheel is power and control, and this is the motivator behind the abuser. This is the motivation behind the abuser, and if the target takes this to heart and understands why the bully is doing what they're doing, or at least uses the model to sort of interpret what they're seeing, it may help. The second part of this wheel is the 8 spokes that you just mentioned, the use of intimidation, emotional abuse, and so on. And these are techniques. They're general techniques. They're not meant to describe every situation because, of course, abusers can be quite creative, including using all kinds of technology to use intimidation and so on. So this idea is that it's just to sort of give you ideas about how these tools can be used. And then third around this wheel is this big black, so the outer side of almost the tire of the wheel, and it says physical and sexual abuse. And this is tied to the idea that, for example, we're not going to see the more overt actions, the inappropriate touching, unusual massages of shoulders, comments about the body, encouraging dangerous work if there's no compliance with certain policies at work, and so on. Those are actually physically and sexually abusive actions. They are more rare. When we look at the study of all the people who looked at it, people do report these things that everybody else could see less often. However, what we are seeing, or at least what I'm seeing in the study as I start to read through these stories and look through the data, is that the more subtle the action, the more common it seems to be. So the most frequent types of responses in the 80s to 90% of people who had a bullying experience say that use of intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, and minimizing, denying, and blaming are so that the right side of the wheel are, although it's not clearly delineated, are more of the more sort of covert actions. The left side of the wheel is actually where you have a potential for discovery and witness because it's more overt, right? Mm-hmm. If you use economic abuse, people can actually prove that their check was docked or they had not been paid. So these techniques, although still used, sadly, in the workplace as a bullying technique, are used a lot less often. Having employer privilege is the idea that the employer treats you like a slave, minimizes all of your efforts, all of those kinds of things. These are things that other people can see, and certainly using other coworkers that involves actual witnesses to the bullying behavior. And oftentimes abusers, what we understand is that they're not necessarily they're not doing things that they want to do in the outward area, right? Mm-hmm. They don't want to be doing this in front of everybody. They understand inherently that this is wrong behavior. Even though they feel justified in doing it, they understand that not many people would approve. So they minimize their covert actions, but they reinforce it with or they minimize the overt actions, but they reinforce it with these subtle actions, these words, name calling. Isolation is a big one, freezing people out. So we had an example for one person responded that they had a boss who never said good morning to them, stopped talking to them entirely after they had made a complaint. However, then one day, about 3 or 4 months after they had reported their boss's behavior to the boss's superior, that the bully actually said good morning. Uh-huh. And it's true. It was a little thing, right? Just saying good morning. Mm-hmm. But it had thrown the target off balance. And and for a week they tried to figure out why did that person say good morning? Because, of course, you've said good morning to this person for 4 months and no response, and then suddenly they're saying good morning. Turns out they were walking with somebody, and that person said, oh, that's so-and-so. They seem nice, don't they? And the individual at that point started to realize and ruminate over their response, which was, they do seem nice, don't they? Mm-hmm. They started to understand that this person was managing their identity because they understood that they were probably a bully, but they wanted to make sure that they looked good in front of other people So when that person walked with other people, the bully would say good morning, and it would look good, and there would be a collegial smile, and so on. So the bully was managing their own identity to make sure that they could continue to have access to the target.
Yeah, that's what I see a lot, this kind of looking good in certain situations. I want to talk about something that I have seen and heard many times, but I just got an email and it addresses this issue. This writer says, very important topic, sometimes, but not always. People assume they are being bullied when a superior or other coworker needs to have something done, and the person on the receiving end of an order several times sometimes claims they are being bullied because they are lazy, incompetent, or defiant, and then they use bullying as an excuse. That is what is giving claimants of bullying no leg to stand on due to crying wolf. What do you make of that?
Well, when I first started this project, and this is a really interesting discussion, and I think we should have more discussions around this, because when I first started this project and the Workplace Bully Wheel, I took it to people I knew in business and in finance. I tried to get the article reviewed but in a business journal, because I thought, this is a workplace thing, maybe this is where it should be. And the response to this was, well, yes, but workers do need to be managed, and not all workers are perfect. And sometimes you have workers who are less motivated than others, and so it is up to management or the employer to make sure that they manage people appropriately and make sure that work is equally distributed and so on. So the suggestion there that some people are not well suited for a job, for example, so they were hired but they are not performing to expectation, and that where employers need to be able to also address that situation, and that makes sense. However, bullying and abuse is different than management rights. So management does have some rights to be able to assess performance and so on. But if it's a long-term, sustained period of negative exposure that clearly differentiates that worker from other individuals and is not necessarily adhering to management protocol, we start to move from what management has the right to do with respect to manage their workforce to an abusive management style, which may include harassment and bullying, which are two different things, by the way. Mm-hmm. So, management does certainly face those situations where maybe they hired someone and they aren't they don't work well within the organization. However, there are a myriad of management styles that you could use to either encourage that person to work, or you could use certain rights within your organization to terminate employment and so on. But there is absolutely no need to abuse that individual as they go through.
Exactly, yeah. And I think what you're saying about this kind of, it's consistency over a long period of time. It's not some one-time thing where somebody says, could you do something, and that employee is just not a good fit for that particular task, and they say, no, I really don't want to, and the employer is encouraging of it because they really need the task done. I think, we're talking about one-time things versus a chronic and consistent set of behaviors over a long period of time, and look at the wheel, because it's really a great tool for understanding what kinds of behaviors Dr. Hannah Scott is really talking about. Now, this is another piece that I'm curious about what your thoughts are. So I think there's also, this very interesting phenomena that can happen when people actually in higher positions structurally are actually getting bullied by, or even swarmed by, other employees or people that even are supervised by them. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, there's a myriad of ways in which bullying can happen, but when we see collectives of people bullying an individual, whether that be a superior or a coworker or an underling. It's called, one of the things it's called is either lateral or horizontal bullying. When it's a one-to-one situation, or when it's multiple people, it's called mobbing in my literature. And it's interesting because I got a lot of calls on this when I was doing the study. People were asking me, and I got emails from colleagues and stuff who had actually looked at the survey. There's a lot of interest in the survey, and they said, "Well, what about mobbing, right? Where I'm being attacked by a whole bunch of coworkers?" The model actually does predict this. What it says is that the bully seeks power and control. And so in this situation, you're mentioning specifically, rank doesn't have a lot to do with it. The employer and how they manage the workplace is the key. So the model predicts that you can use the coworkers to do your bullying for you. So in the case, for example, where you have a manager and they manage an office of, say, 10 to 15 people, and 4 people are ganging up on one person, the manager in this case is identified as the bully. The technique they're using is the coworkers, because they're not stopping, or in some cases even promoting that bullying by either ignoring it or participating in it, right, and giving the okay to the coworkers, to the mob, if you will, to attack this coworker and establish an unusual pecking order. In the case where you have a series of coworkers that you've mentioned, where you have a superior, and you have I assume it's the people that they manage below them are mobbing them or attacking them. They are coordinated together in bullying efforts. This becomes the responsibility of the superior's superior. Because so in that particular case, the manager is being bullied by the people they manage.
Correct.
The manager should go to their superior and say, I'm being bullied by this. And it's the superior's job, the manager of the manager, to come down and deal with the workplace environment and make it safe for that manager. It's about employee safety. So where that's not done, the manager goes to the manager and it says, I need help, and the manager's manager does not respond. They're using the coworkers to bully the manager by in this case, ignoring it or participating in it. And I hope that's certainly not the case for that individual.
But that does, okay, so when you say that individual, so I have heard these kinds of stories from so many people where they're in some kind of managerial role and they're getting bullied and, or using your language, mobbed. And this is like, the experience is so difficult for the manager because they believe that they are in a position where, of course they're supervising and they have to make sure that, employees are doing certain tasks and deliverables are being, timelines are being met and deliverables are being delivered, and they're now somehow being put in a position where they themselves are being bullied. And it's confusing for the manager. And because I've been hearing it about these kinds of situations so frequently, I'm so glad that, you've included a conceptualization of this in your model. Clearly you've been hearing about it as well, that it's not that unusual. And I guess that's the point, is that I want to let people know that, based on your research, that in fact it can go up and it can go down, it can go lateral, it can be mobbing, it can happen in so many different ways, and that, the first thing to be aware of is that, yes, this may really be happening. This may really actually be occurring in your workplace, and what is the impact on you? And this gets me to the next piece. I believe that, when people have an experience of bullying, it could set off such extreme feelings of shame and self-blame that they are at risk for suicide, for feelings of suicidality. And I wonder if you could speak to that issue and what you have been hearing from the people who are reaching out to you, Dr. Scott.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that. As I start to read through these stories, and actually while the survey was running, I had people write to me individually, telling me that the week before they were having thoughts of suicide, but they were heartened by the fact that the study is going on and that there's understanding. And I, of course, made sure that they had a lot of the resources. Our Research Ethics Board requires that we have these things when we hear these thoughts, when people discuss these things with us, that we have a number of resources from which to give so that they can find help, at least to the best of our ability. And so I did that. But we do hear a lot of that. I keep saying we, but it's really only me that did the study. I'm used to working in teams. So, but when I did this pilot study, one of the things that does come through is that people do have suicidal ideation as a result of extreme stress. And this is not unanticipated if you think that some cases of bullying can be so extreme as to lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. Another way we can look at it is what we know about, for example, intimate partner violence, right? Because this is a model that's based on intimate relationships where bullies are using both overt and covert tactics. That we now know in the literature that emotional and psychological abuse, especially with respect to children or intimate partners, when they're being exposed to abuse, can be more damaging in many cases than physical or sexual abuse in many ways, depending on what it's paired with. And so when you are exposed daily in your work environment, questioning your work, berated, belittled, intimate partner violence and the power control wheel suggest that, yes, some people are being exposed so clearly exposed to a mass amount of abuse that they are getting post-traumatic stress disorder, which can include suicidal ideation. We are now seeing at least some of the anecdotally, as I'm reading through these stories, many people do mention that they at some point either became suicidal and decided that that was a stress point. They recognized that in their minds and they left their jobs and they feel better. In some cases, some people are continuing to be exposed to the bullying and they're trying to make a decision and they are having suicidal ideation. So this is not as common as anger, emotional upset, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. But in some cases, we are seeing that the abuse that they're experiencing is so severe that they are having some terrible thoughts.
Yeah. Dr. Gerald Lauren Fishkin, he is a psychologist, clinical psychologist, and he's the author of The Science of Shame and Its Treatment, and he writes about how shame is a deep-seated affect located deep within the mammalian portions of the brain, and he makes a point that, shame and guilt, they're really, really different things, but that this experience of very toxic shame can be very crippling, and it usually starts in childhood. This idea of toxic shame, comes from, what you were exposed to as a young child and the undermining, kind of crippling things that you were exposed to, for your own self-concept, your sense of well-being in the world around you, your sense that you have a right on this planet, that you're okay, that you're going to be okay. And, he talks about this toxic shame and how deeply rooted it can be. And, when we talk about suicidality, I'm thinking about people who even have, deep-seated, historical wounds, and then they go to the workplace and they're having these terrible kind of experiences of being bullied, and how that could lead to, really devastating outcomes, and, maybe even going beyond suicidal ideation, but actual self-harm or risk of self-harm. And, Dr. Gerald Lauren Fishkin, talks about how, it's one thing to do cognitive behavioral therapy and, talk about, the things that you think about yourself, have a positive outlook, expose yourself to positive ideas, correct your inner languaging, and all of these kinds of things. They may be fine when you don't have profoundly deep-rooted, severe, toxic feelings of shame or your own historical trauma. But when you're exposed to something very disturbing at the workplace that undermines how you're actually feeling, this notion of correcting your thoughts with, positive self-talk and positive affirmations may really not touch the deeply rooted feelings of distress you may be experiencing. And so I really want to appeal to the people who are listening today to recognize, to understand that if you've got something that's getting triggered as a result of workplace bullying or harassment, that you make sure that you go and find a way to deeply work with this inner wound with a therapist who can really help you focus on that in a deep and respectful way. So you're really kind of going to the core of the places of pain that are getting evoked or re-triggered by the bullying at the workplace. And that's not to say that bullying at the workplace doesn't stand alone. It does. But sometimes it can re-trigger feelings of shame, and I think it's that shameful feeling, that toxic shame, that makes a person more at risk of suicidal ideation and more devastating potential for self-harm. Your comments, Dr. Scott?
Well, I think on one hand it's really important to support the victim as they're going through this process, and from what we're starting to learn about this, this is a very common, bullying has become a very common management technique amongst parts of companies, if not sometimes at the very top of the company. However, the other thing I think we also have to keep in mind is that on the flip side of it, employers also need to be able to understand and invest and hear the situations that might be happening to their workers. At first pass, it's easy to say, well, maybe this person is lazy or maybe this person isn't a good fit. But if you're hearing these stories over and over again, it's worthwhile to actually invest in this because you're losing so much as an employer. Your employee is helping you and is the sort of litmus test in telling you that you have a problem, and you need to support that employee in trying to help you identify what the problems might be in your organization. Because if you don't, as an employer, you're going to have increased disability claims, increased benefit use, more use of sick days, loss of productivity, high turnover with respect to all of your product and your company. So this can be extraordinarily costly, and we're already working that into the price of your product. Listening to the person who is saying that they might be bullied, it's worthwhile to investigate and find out what might be going on there, because that is the canary in the coal mine for many organizations to stopping a toxic work environment. We do know that when people have what they call toxic work environments, it goes on for a long, long period of time. And everybody is throwing up their hands and saying, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to stop this culture of toxicity. The issue is to start listening to people and to not work it into your model, to have a strong, resolute, and active set of programs for both employees and the employer. Right now, currently, if I look through the literature correctly, we actually have no programs for bullies. If you have a bully in your organization, but you want to retain them because they have a large amount of knowledge, for example, or they have sufficient leadership or seniority, what do you do with that person? If you cannot terminate them, is there treatment for the people who are actually abusive? And we don't have anything coherent in workplace environments for that. And so that's the flip side of the coin. So it may be triggering other things, and we certainly need to support the employee. But employers also need to figure out and understand the importance of those people who are sending those canaries out.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important point because, the other piece of this is that when somebody's bullied or ostracized or feels like they're on the outside of what's happening, they're not going to be productive, and they're going to be demoralized and feeling very unhappy and unwell. Somehow, if you've got somebody who is part of the workforce and they are the problem, they're the bully, unless there's some way to help that individual, it's like, I really believe in this idea of be part of the evolution, be part of the change. So that means that, workplaces have to come up with ways to help people who are engaged in this bullying behavior do better and evolve in their own character and behavior. And there is actually some evidence that this does make a difference, whereas something like mediation may not make any difference at all because it just puts the target in a situation where they have to encounter the bully in yet another circumstance. What are your thoughts on mediation?
Again, looking at what we know from intimate partner violence, there's different ways of handling abuser and victim sort of relationships in mediation, through counseling and so on. But for the vast majority of them, they agree that having the abuser and the victim co-counseled or mediated together in the same room does not necessarily acknowledge that power imbalance. Mm-hmm. And so, because we don't actually have any programs, what I would suggest is maybe we need to look at what we know about power imbalance and intimate partner relationships, apply this to the workforce, and figure out maybe what we would need to go forward here. Bringing in an abuser and a target into the same room with HR, union, and so on really doesn't address the fact that the employee who's being bullied is at the bottom rung with respect to the power and control. They are being subject to abuse, and they may have been subject to abuse for years. We have to understand that employee and know that after 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years of abuse, that is a different person than who started at the company 7 years or 4 years prior.
Right.
They have been abused and battered. Not battered like physically, but emotionally and physically put through the ringer. And they may not have the confidence to be articulate. They may fear retribution. And these are all very real things. And they may fear that there's no solution for them, which may be the case as well, because we have to examine who we're siding with in those meetings if we are the mediator. So my gut says, although again there's no research out there, it's that we're going into new territory. My gut says that IPV relationships and how we mediate those are usually not bringing in the abuser and the victim into the same space to try to solve that solution. That each individual has to get right in their own minds before any sort of discussion can happen about what that relationship can look like.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Now, just in closing, I want to say that, we are woven to have a basic instinct of being part of a larger human community or a tribe, and when we are subject to bullying, we no longer feel like we're part of a tribe. We feel excluded, and that experience of being excluded from the group, having people turning against you, can feel extremely distressing. It feels like you're isolated in ways that are impossible to navigate. And I want you to really be aware of taking care of yourself. See if you can find somebody who you can work with to help you with if there's underlying issues that are making this worse. But really, if you're being bullied, it's time to really look at what you might be able to do to make to step into a new way of working if you have some other options, because it can be very devastating to stay in a place like that. You can be demoralized for many, many years, and it can really undermine your sense of well-being. You may have been a superstar at what you do, and all of a sudden you don't feel good at what you do at all. Figuring out how to navigate that and possibly find a new place may be your best choice, because we know that in a lot of cases, that's what ends up happening anyways. People end up outside of their workplace. So take care of yourself and find ways to figure out strategies so that this bullying does not continue. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Scott, for your work, and hope that we'll get a chance to speak more in the future.
Thank you for having me. It was an absolute delight.
Absolutely great. Thank you again, and I hope that we will have that opportunity. And for those listeners out there, I want you to just realize that you're not in the wrong if you're being bullied, and that if that's what's going on in your workplace, and if that's the culture of the workplace, that you really need to take the time now to figure out what your other options are, and not to just get into a place where you start to lose yourself and feel completely demoralized and unwell. So I want to sign off and thank everybody, and thank our
our producer, Gary Labar, for hosting us again today. And have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, doctors, for a very interesting and very, very important subject. We appreciate it very much. Enjoy the day.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed right here on Reality Radio 101.